The most dangerous man alive
I will
didn't fear
protect
death
you, Ethan.
until a single message changed everything. Damian Cross existed at the highest tier of control the world had ever witnessed. Governments did not pursue him directly. They negotiated distance. Criminal networks did not challenge him. They adjusted their operations around his decisions. His empire was not built on noise or visibility, but on calculated silence that stretched across continents like an invisible law. Every system beneath him functioned on one principle: certainty under his command, elimination of anything unpredictable. In Damian Cross's reality, emotion was not simply suppressed. It was treated as structural failure. Anything that introduced hesitation was removed before it could evolve into weakness. That discipline had shaped him into something closer to a force than a man, an entity whose presence alone recalibrated power dynamics without a single spoken word. Inside his command network, stability was absolute. Financial systems flowed without disruption. Operational units reported with precision. Intelligence channels fed him only verified outcomes, never speculation. Even his closest subordinates understood a silent rule: nothing reached Damian unless it had already been filtered through multiple layers of certainty. But control, no matter how perfected, always met its first fracture in the form of interruption. It began without warning during a routine, encrypted briefing cycle. Internal systems registered a breach anomaly, subtle at first, almost dismissible. A secondary alert followed, then another, each one bypassing expected security layers with impossible precision. It was not aggressive enough to be classified as war. It was not random enough to be ignored. It was targeted. Damian did not react outwardly. He never did. But those observing him closely noticed the shift in stillness. His focus detached from the ongoing operational reports and locked onto the anomaly stream with absolute concentration. In his world, attention was the first phase of dominance. The encrypted message arrived without origin signature. No traceable source. No classification tag. No warning protocol. It simply appeared inside a protected layer of his private channel, as if reality itself had chosen to bypass his defenses. Damian opened it. The screen displayed a single line of text: "You're a father." For a moment, the world did not move forward in his perception. It did not escalate, compute, or respond. It simply paused in a way nothing in his life had ever been allowed to do. The statement should have been meaningless. It had no verification chain, no contextual data, no operational relevance. Yet it remained on his screen like an object that refused to be processed out of existence. His first instinct was rejection, not emotional rejection, but systemic denial. He initiated an immediate full-spectrum verification sweep across every internal intelligence grid: financial anomalies, historical overlaps, surveillance gaps, anything that could classify the message as manipulation or psychological intrusion. While the system executed, something unfamiliar surfaced beneath his control. Not fear, not confusion. Memory. Fragments he had buried beneath years of calculated detachment began to surface in unstructured flashes. Names never spoken again, decisions that removed people from his world permanently, and one erased timeline he had never allowed himself to revisit. He terminated the intrusion attempt on his own thoughts instinctively, but it was already too late. For the first time, Damian Cross was not evaluating a threat. He was evaluating the possibility that something outside his control had already rewritten part of his life without permission. And in that moment, deep within his empire's intelligence architecture, a dormant file that should remain permanently sealed began to unlock itself. A hidden file unlocks, revealing a name Damian has erased from his past. The system did not unlock the file by accident. In Damian Cross's world, nothing dormant reactivated without cause. Every sealed archive had been buried through deliberate erasure, layered with redundancies designed to ensure permanent disappearance. Yet this file surfaced as if time itself had decided to challenge his authority. Damian Cross stared at the decrypted data stream as it unfolded across the secured interface. At first, it was fragmented: corrupted identity markers, partially erased biometric traces, and incomplete historical records that should not have survived multiple purges. But beneath the corruption was structure, familiar structure. A name pattern emerged that his system hesitated to fully reconstruct, not because it was missing, but because it had been intentionally destroyed. The woman linked to the record was not unknown to him. She belonged to a section of his past that had been systematically removed from operational memory, relationships never archived, interactions never logged, and emotional proximity never acknowledged within official channels. Damian Cross had not simply ended connections in that period of his life. He had erased them with a precision reserved for threats. Yet here she was again, reconstructed through encrypted remnants that had survived his own judgment. As the intelligence layer deepened its scan, additional fragments surfaced. Financial movement trails from years ago, temporary relocation records, medical entries that had been wiped from public systems but preserved in fragmented backups across disconnected networks. None of it formed a complete narrative on its own, but together, they pointed towards something Damian had never permitted himself to consider in structured form. A child. The system did not present it as certainty at first. It flagged probability clusters, biometric alignment potential, and timeline correlation inconsistencies. But Damian understood data better than interpretation layers. When multiple incomplete systems began converging toward a single conclusion, probability was no longer theoretical. It was directional truth. For the first time in years, his internal decision engine introduced delay, not hesitation in the emotional sense, but pause in execution sequencing. Commands that would normally be issued instantly remained suspended in validation loops longer than acceptable thresholds. That deviation did not go unnoticed. Across his empire, subordinate systems began flagging anomalies in leadership response patterns. Financial approvals were held longer than baseline. Strategic escalations were postponed by seconds that should not have accumulated. Individually, they were insignificant. Together, they formed a pattern that had never existed in Damian Cross's operational history. Delay, not failure, not disruption. Delay born from internal recalibration. Inside secured intelligence channels, analysts attempted to interpret the shift. Some labeled it caution. Others labeled it recalculation under uncertain variables. But those closest to Damian understood something more dangerous was occurring. He was thinking in directions without predefined outcomes. The decrypted archive continued expanding. Additional identity layers surfaced, revealing hidden relational pathways that connected the erased woman to a timeline Damian had deliberately compartmentalized from his present identity. Every recovered fragment reinforced the same structural implication. Something he had removed from his life had continued without him, and it had left consequences behind. Damian crossed it alone in his command space, surrounded by silence engineered for control. Yet for the first time, that silence did not feel absolute. It felt interrupted by the presence of something that existed outside his authority. His gaze remained fixed on the system output as the final verification cycle completed. A remote intelligence node returned with high-priority confirmation. A location signature had been detected through residual trace reconstruction, not historical, not archived, active, real-time, and it was not far enough away to ignore. The system flagged it as a live coordinate feed, continuously updating, as if something or someone had unknowingly remained within reach of the most dangerous man alive. Damian Cross did not move, but every system around him prepared for what came next, because somewhere in the world he had erased, something had just started moving again. The coordinates did not lead to power. They did not lead to a fortress, a private military compound, or any structure associated with Damian Cross's known sphere of influence. Instead, the system traced a location into something far more disarming. Ordinary space, a quiet residential district where life continued without awareness of the machinery operating beyond its borders. No armored patrol routes, no encrypted surveillance grids, no visible indicators that anything important existed within its boundaries. It was the kind of place designed by invisibility itself, where people could exist without being noticed by systems like his. And yet the intelligence confirmation did not waver. A child existed there. The system designated him as Ethan Cross. The name did not trigger recognition through memory. It triggered recognition through absence. Damian Cross had no record of authorizing such an identity. No structured file. No retained oversight. The lack of documentation was not accidental omission. It was deliberate erasure across multiple layers of controlled information architecture. Something had been hidden from him with precision equal to his own. Further surveillance reconstructions confirmed a second presence within the same environment, a woman operating under suppressed identity protocols, moving through daily life without digital footprint continuity, not completely invisible, but fragmented enough to avoid attention from systems designed to track anomalies like her. She was not escaping the world. She was surviving inside it. The child, however, remained the center of all fragmented data points. Small indicators, medical traces, educational proximity markers, indirect environmental interactions confirmed sustained presence. Nothing suggested wealth, protection infrastructure, or organizational backing. No visible enforcement. No defensive perimeter consistent with Damien Cross's world. The implication was immediate and destabilizing. If the child belonged to him, then he had not protected what mattered. He had left it unguarded. For the first time in his operational existence, Damien Cross encountered a contradiction that did not resolve through control logic. Every system he had built was designed around ownership of outcomes, yet this reality had existed independently of his awareness. The intelligence network escalated the confirmation layer. Biometric correlation analysis completed. Genetic linkage probability exceeded acceptable uncertainty thresholds. The result was no longer theoretical inference. It was classification. Biological connection verified. Damien Cross did not react outwardly. His expression remained unchanged, but the internal structure of decision-making beneath it began to fracture into parallel paths. One path demanded immediate extraction. One demanded full suppression of exposure. One attempted to analyze whether the situation could be contained without external detection. None of them aligned cleanly. That was new. Responsibility entered his framework without permission, not emotional responsibility in the traditional sense, but structural ownership of consequence. Something existed now that could not be reversed, reclassified, or erased through operational intervention. The child was real, and connected to him in a way that bypassed every filter he had ever used to separate personal history from present identity. For a brief moment, Damien Cross did not calculate empire-level risk. He calculated proximity to something irreplaceable. That calculation alone disrupted the stability of his usual hierarchy of priorities. Control no longer came first. Containment of vulnerability did. He issued his first directive regarding the location. Covert surveillance only. No exposure. No engagement. No disruption of civilian pattern integrity. Observation became priority over intervention. But even as the order was transmitted across encrypted channels, something deeper inside his system refused to stabilize. Because observation implied distance, and distance was no longer a reliable concept. Within minutes, intelligence feeds adjusted to the new directive. Surveillance nodes began positioning around the residential zone, mapping movement patterns, identifying structural vulnerabilities, and establishing silent overwatch grids. At first, everything appeared stable. Then the system flagged irregularity. Multiple independent detection nodes registered movement within the perimeter that did not match civilian behavior patterns or authorize surveillance activity. The feed stabilized on a single confirmation sequence. Unknown armed observers, already inside the perimeter. Control had always been Damien Cross's only constant. Empires rose and fell around him. Governments shifted policies in response to his pressure, and entire criminal networks adapted their survival strategies around his decisions. Yet none of it ever touched the structure he believed was unbreakable: his ability to anticipate, contain, and eliminate uncertainty before it matured into consequence. That illusion began to fracture the moment surveillance feeds stabilized into something undeniable. The residential perimeter surrounding the child's location was no longer passive. It had become active in a way that did not belong to routine observation or opportunistic threat testing. Movement patterns were now structured, layered, and synchronized across multiple blind zones that should not have been accessible simultaneously. The intelligence classification changed within minutes. Not intrusion, preparation. A coordinated group had positioned itself with intent that went beyond surveillance. Their spacing indicated discipline. Their timing indicated planning. Their silence indicated experience. This was not an opportunistic strike. waiting for an opening. It was an operation already in motion, simply waiting for execution authorization. Damien reviewed the data once, then again, and something in his internal processing changed. Not panic, not confusion. Priority restructuring. For the first time, threat assessment did not begin with Empire stability. It began with location proximity to Ethan Cross. Every metric recalibrated around a single variable that had never existed in his system before. Irreversible vulnerability. He issued immediate extraction protocol activation. Silent evacuation teams were mobilized within seconds. Containment units shifted from perimeter observation to layered reinforcement positioning. Exit routes were mapped and revalidated in real time. Every available asset within range was redirected toward one objective: ensure physical removal of the child from any conflict zone before engagement escalation. But even as commands propagated through his network, something more fundamental began to shift. Damien Cross was no longer observing operations from strategic distance. He was entering the equation personally. The decision did not pass through extended analysis layers. It bypassed structured approval logic entirely. It simply occurred, as if control had reached its limit and something older beneath it had taken precedence. His movement triggered immediate response across his empire. Internal systems flagged anomaly-level deviation from standard command hierarchy. Advisors attempted clarification requests that were not answered. Security teams recalibrated protective protocols around his absence. Entire operational grids paused momentarily, uncertain whether leadership had shifted or fractured. It had not fractured. It had condensed. Within minutes, Damien Cross was en route. The departure was not announced. It was detected, and detection was enough, because in his world, when Damien Cross moved without delegation, it meant the situation had crossed from strategic importance into existential priority. Rival factions noticed first. Signals that had remained dormant for months activated simultaneously across encrypted underground channels. Intelligence brokers recalculated probabilities. Competing organizations that had previously avoided direct confrontation began interpreting movement data as opportunity or threat, depending on proximity, to the unfolding situation. The global underground system reacted like a living organism, sensing a shift in apex pressure. Rumors formed before facts arrived. Damien Cross is moving, not through intermediaries, not through proxies, directly. The implication spread faster than verification. Some interpreted weakness, others interpreted war initiation. But those who understood his behavioral architecture recognized something far more dangerous. Focus had replaced distance. And focus, in Damien Cross, always meant escalation. Back at the residential perimeter, surveillance feeds continued transmitting real-time updates. The unknown armed observers were no longer static. Their formations tightened. Their positioning adjusted with final phase discipline. Then the system registered a new classification spike. Behavioral change detected. Target acquisition protocols initiated. The operation had moved beyond preparation. It had entered execution threshold. Inside Damien Cross's moving transport, the final intelligence update arrived across his secure channel. No ambiguity. No delay. A direct assassination phase had just begun targeting the child's safe house. When enemies touched the child, the Empire stopped being business. The first phase of the assault did not begin with noise. It began with precision disruption. External surveillance grids around the safe house flickered, then collapsed in controlled segments as coordinated interference severed visibility layers one by one. Communication channels inside the perimeter failed next, not through brute force, but through calculated overload designed to isolate defenders from coordination. Within seconds, the environment that had been classified as contained turned into a closed system under hostile control. Security personnel attempted immediate response protocol, but the attack was already positioned inside their decision window. Entry points were breached simultaneously from multiple vectors, suggesting preparation long before detection. The objective was not engagement. It was containment collapse. And then, the system registered a change no one inside the perimeter expected. Damien Cross had arrived. His presence did not announce itself through coordination. It manifested as consequence. The moment he stepped into proximity of the engagement zone, operational structure shifted. Attackers who had been advancing with synchronized confidence experienced immediate disruption in timing cohesion, as if the environment itself had recalculated their probability of survival. Damien did not issue commands at first. He removed resistance. Movement became decisive, controlled, and absolute. Every interaction was final, not excessive, not emotional in expression, but precise in execution. The attackers who encountered him first understood within seconds that they were no longer participating in operation. They were inside a correction. Inside the structure, chaos began to fragment under his presence. Defensive personnel regained partial coordination as external pressure destabilized. What had been a collapsing system began to reassemble itself around a single stabilizing force, Damien Cross moving through it. But this was no longer about Empire mechanics. Something had shifted beneath his operational identity. Every step he took carried weight that did not originate from strategy. It came from recognition of vulnerability in proximity to something he could not allow to be compromised. That recognition bypassed logic layers and settled into something far more primitive: protection. In the inner room of the structure, the mother was found first, disoriented but intact. She moved instinctively toward cover as the environment destabilized around her. Her awareness locked onto Damien immediately, not as an authority figure, but as the only fixed point in a collapsing scenario. She did not speak. There was no need, because behind her, the child was visible. Ethan Cross stood within the protected interior space, small and still, surrounded by controlled chaos leaking through the edges of what should have been absolute safety. The moment Damien saw him, the structure of his internal world reclassified itself in real time. This was not data, not objective analysis, not operational intelligence. This was presence. For the first time in his existence, Damien Cross did not evaluate what the child represented. He registered that the child simply was, and that was now outweighed everything else he had ever controlled. The remaining attackers inside the structure were systematically neutralized as his reinforcement units secured outer collapse zones. Resistance diminished rapidly, replaced by fragmented survival attempts that no longer aligned with their original coordination. But Damien's focus did not expand outward again. It narrowed, because the moment had already changed him, not in ideology, in structure. The child's breathing, the mother's proximity, the absence of immediate threat between them, and the collapsing perimeter, all of it reorganized something inside Damien Cross that had never been permitted to exist without function. Protective instinct was no longer theoretical. It was active. Then, in the final stabilization phase of the engagement, one surviving attacker was pulled from partial cover, injured and disoriented, barely conscious but still aware enough to understand what had happened. Damien turned toward him. The room fell into controlled silence. The attacker coughed, struggled to focus, then smiled faintly through pain as if recognition itself carried final meaning. And then he spoke. Not a warning, not a threat, a name that did not belong to an enemy outside the system, but to someone inside Damien Cross's own organization. The enemy wasn't outside, it was already sitting at his table. The name spoken by the surviving attacker did not echo loudly. It did not need to. In Damien Cross's world, certain truths did not rely on sound to create impact. They collapsed structure simply by existing. For a brief moment, the operational environment around it became silent in a way that was not tactical, but psychological. Not confusion, not shock, something far more dangerous inside an organization built on absolute certainty. Recognition of internal breach. Damien Cross did not react outwardly. His expression remained controlled, but the systems beneath his command began shifting instantly into verification mode. Every internal channel connected to the named individual was isolated. Communication logs were frozen. Financial access points were sealed for review. Historical decision pathways were reconstructed backward through encrypted layers. What emerged was not speculation. It was structure. A trusted ally had not simply participated in the assassination attempt. They had architected its access layer. Permissions that should have required multi-level authorization had been subtly redefined over time. Blind spots were not created in a single moment. They were engineered through prolonged proximity to power. The realization did not trigger emotional instability. It triggered recalibration. Inside Damien Cross's empire, loyalty had always been an invisible foundation, holding everything together. Now that foundation was compromised. The entire structure responded like a living system detecting infection. Containment protocols activated automatically across multiple regions. Communication channels were segmented into isolated verification loops. Operational teams received silent updates that trust hierarchy was no longer assumed. It had to be revalidated continuously. Within minutes, the Empire no longer functioned as a unified system. It functioned as monitored fragments. Those closest to Damien Cross felt the shift first. Orders that once flowed with unquestioned authority now passed through additional silent validation layers. Long-standing command relationships dissolved into procedural distance. Even his most trusted inner circle experienced something they had never encountered before. Suspicion without explanation. At the center of this restructuring, Damien Cross stood motionless while his internal network reconstructed betrayal into full visibility. Patterns that had once been dismissed as operational inconsistencies now aligned into deliberate architecture. Delays, miscommunications, strategic misdirections, each one connected to a single origin point, a name that had once represented loyalty, now reclassified as structural threat. And beneath all of it, something deeper began forming inside Damien Cross's internal processing. Not emotional collapse, but compression. The more betrayal became quantified, the less emotional fragmentation remained. What replaced it was direction. Singular, focused, irreversible. Protection of the child. Ethan Cross was no longer just a discovered truth inside his world. He had become the fixed point around which every remaining system now revolved. Everything unstable could be rebuilt. Everything compromised could be removed. But that one presence could not be replaced under any condition. That realization permanently altered Damien Cross's operational architecture. The Empire was no longer being managed for expansion, influence, or dominance. It was being rebuilt as a containment structure around one irreplaceable life. He initiated internal purge protocols without delay, not chaotic elimination, systematic extraction. Every compromised access layer was identified and frozen. Every communication node linked to the betrayal chain was isolated. Entire subdivisions of his organization were placed under silent lockdown, pending verification. The empire that once operated through trust had now shifted into continuous authentication. Loyalty was no longer a foundation. It was a variable under constant threat. As the purge expanded across his network, Damien Cross received a secondary intelligence stream from a previously untouched monitoring layer. A fragmented signal buried beneath multiple encryption redundancies surfaced unexpectedly, flagged as high-priority anomaly. He opened it and stopped because this was not confirmation of betrayal. This was structure beyond betrayal. A second plan had already been activated inside his system long before the first had been exposed. And its target was no longer limited to the Empire. It was aimed at both Damien Cross and the child. He stopped being a ruler and became something far more dangerous. The moment the second hidden plan was confirmed, Damien Cross no longer operated within the framework of leadership. He shifted into something the world had never cataloged correctly, an entity that did not manage an empire, but redefined it in real time based on a single living priority. The child was moved immediately, not through standard extraction channels, but through layered contingency routes designed for scenarios that had never been activated before. Every corridor of movement was pre-cleared, every transition zone sealed, every possible interception point neutralized before arrival. The destination was not just secure, it was architecturally isolated from any known external influence network. At the same time, the mother was fully integrated into the same protection structure. Her identity was no longer treated as peripheral. It was essential to stability. Her presence was the only consistent variable that kept the child environment emotionally coherent. And Damien's system had already recalculated that emotional stability now had operational value. What had begun as concealment had transformed into containment of life itself. Inside this reinforced environment, something subtle began to shift in Damien Cross. He did not express attachment in visible form. He did not redefine himself through sentiment. Instead, his transformation manifested through structure. Every decision he made now originated from a single principle: prevent disruption to what cannot be replaced. The empire beneath him responded instantly to his internal change. What once functioned as a hierarchy of power was systematically converted into a defensive architecture. Offensive operations were downgraded to secondary status. Intelligence units were reorganized into predictive threat mapping systems. Financial networks were repurposed to sustain rapid response infrastructure. Communication channels were stripped of ambiguity and rebuilt into verification loops that allowed no assumption of loyalty. Trust had been eliminated as a requirement. Only confirmation remained. Across the global underground landscape, this transformation did not go unnoticed. Rival factions that had once calculated Damien Cross as a control variable now began recalculating him as instability itself. Reports spread through encrypted networks describing the same phenomenon. Every time pressure was applied to his system, his response did not weaken. It intensified into precision counteraction. He was no longer behaving like an empire head. He was behaving like a protective force that had removed all internal limits. And in that shift, unpredictability became his greatest weapon. Inside Damien Cross, emotional identity did not fracture. It consolidated. Everything that once existed as distance, calculation, and control now reorganized into a single directional force centered entirely on survival of the child. Ethan Cross was no longer a discovery. He was the axis. Every layer of Damien's remaining humanity, once suppressed beneath structure, now existed only for one function: protection without compromise. Even his enemies began to understand the change in observable behavior patterns. Negotiation thresholds disappeared. Warning cycles shortened. Response time to threats became immediate, bypassing all previous escalation layers. There was no longer hesitation between detection and action. There was only removal, and that removal extended to anything that even resembled risk. The world had once feared Damien Cross because he controlled outcomes. Now it feared him because he no longer required outcomes to be stable in order to act. He required only one condition to initiate total system response: threat proximity to the child. As internal restructuring stabilized, Damien stood within a secure zone where Ethan Cross remained protected. The child was unaware of the scale of conflict reshaping the world around him, unaware that his existence had redefined global underground equilibrium. The mother remained close, observing the transformation not through fear, but through recognition that survival had become dependent on a man who no longer behaved like any version of himself in the past. And Damien Cross, standing at the center of a system now built entirely around him, no longer saw himself as the ruler of an empire. He had become its weapon, not for conquest, but for preservation. And as that realization completed its final stage of permanence, distant intelligence networks across multiple regions began transmitting synchronized alerts. Something unprecedented was happening. Multiple Empire locations had just come under simultaneous large-scale attack. Power meant nothing anymore, only survival of what was his. The first strike against Damien Cross's empire was not loud. It was coordinated silence, breaking across multiple systems at once. Financial nodes destabilized. Communication relays went dark. Operational cells in 3 continents reported simultaneous breach attempts that were too synchronized to be independent. This was not chaos. It was orchestration. An attempt designed to fracture his empire from within while external pressure applied force at every remaining structural point. Under normal conditions, such an attack would have forced offensive redistribution, hesitation, analysis loops. But Damien Cross no longer operated under normal conditions. He activated full counteroffensive architecture without delay. Across the globe, dormant response systems awakened. Units that had never been deployed simultaneously began moving in coordinated precision. Financial countermeasures locked hostile accounts in real time. Communication interception grids reversed infiltration attempts and converted them into traceable exposure pathways. Entire enemy coordination networks began collapsing as their own structure was turned against them. The Empire did not defend itself. It reacted as a single living weapon. At the center of it, Damien Cross remained completely focused on one immutable constant. The child's safety status remained stable, protected, isolated, untouched by the unfolding war outside the secure zone. That stability was the only metric that mattered. Everything else was secondary. As the counteroffensive expanded, internal betrayal nodes began surfacing under pressure. The hidden network that had once operated beneath his system fractured under exposure. Names that had once been protected by proximity to power were now stripped of insulation. Communication lines that had once enabled manipulation were permanently severed. What followed was not revenge. It was removal of systemic contamination. One by one, compromised elements of his empire collapsed under controlled extraction protocols. No longer hidden, no longer protected by internal loyalty structures, they were neutralized as operational threats with clinical precision. Across global underground systems, fear shifted shape. Damien Cross was no longer being interpreted as an empire leader under attack. He was being recognized as an adaptive force that could no longer be destabilized through conventional warfare. And through all of it, the transformation inside him completed its final stage. The man who had once ruled through dominance and calculated control no longer existed in the same form. What remained was not softer, not weaker, but singular in purpose. Father Protector identity had fully replaced Empire authority as the center of all decision-making. Every action now flowed through a single irreversible condition. Preserve the child at any cost that does not endanger the child. The Empire stabilized under this new structure, not as a traditional hierarchy, but as a protective war system designed around a single life that could not be replaced. As the final wave of internal threats was eliminated, operational silence returned across global networks. Enemy systems that had coordinated the attack were either dismantled or forced into permanent retreat. The attempt to destabilize Damien Cross's empire had instead revealed its final evolution. It was no longer vulnerable in the way empires usually were, because it no longer existed for expansion. It existed for protection. Inside the secure zone, the child remained safe. The mother remained close. And Damien Cross stood within a system that now reflected his internal transformation completely. For the first time, there was stability not built on fear, but on preservation. And in that stability, the world believed the conflict had ended. But deep inside his world, someone was already studying the child for revenge no one sees coming.